All right, let's take our Bible together this morning, and if you would turn to Psalm 142. A recent Gallup poll I discovered talked about the top problems in the workplace. What would you say were the top 5 problems that you would guess? Number 5 was burnout. That is due to understaffing and unrealistic expectations. 45% said burnout. 47% said lack of promotions. That's especially true of younger workers. They didn't feel like there was a possibility of advancing. Number 3 was poor leadership. 55% said I've got problems with my boss in communicating feedback, support. Number 2, what would you think would be the second most? It was unreasonable workload. 58% said that it was due to inflexible schedules and excessive overtime. Number 1, what would you think would be the number 1 reason for a job problem? Yeah, poor pay. Inadequate pay was the top concern, 63%. Our question this week is, what do you do when you have work problems? What do you do when you have work problems? We looked last week at what goal you have set for your job. We said very plainly that God says your top goal, your chief reason for going to your job is not to make money. And if that's your reason for going, you're missing it. Your job is much more than about making money and putting food on the table and paying the bills. That's a secondary goal. The top goal, God says, is what? Do you remember? To spread the reign of God where you work. To seek first the kingdom of God there. In the way you talk, in the way you act, in the way you plan, people are supposed to see God's representative there, and hopefully that will draw them to him through your example. That is the chief goal. And that also includes in the way you respond to problems, job problems, like what we just talked about. People are watching us. People are watching you. And you, by your good and patient and appropriate response to job problems, can cause people to want to move toward Christ. Now, this would include, proper responses would include that if you're being mistreated, that you respond sort of respectfully to the offender, and you will speak to them in private and professionally about what's bothering you. If that doesn't work, well, then you might consider consulting the employee handbook for the right way to proceed and deal with this and talk to the right people. If that doesn't seem to work, then you follow up the chain of command to higher levels of management in order to deal with your problem. In all of this, remembering that your chief goal there is what? To spread the reign of Christ as you deal with the problem. It isn't to fix the problem. It isn't to make money, but it's to spread the reign of Christ as you fix the problem. And again, people could move toward Christ by your right response. However, what do you do when you've done everything you know how to do to fix a problem and it doesn't fix the problem? You've gone through all the proper things, everything you can think of, you've done. Do you then just quit? Okay, I'm out of here. I'm done. Many have said that. I would say that is not God's plan yet. God has 2 last crucial steps that you should take when you have job problems, that you should take before you make a decision to leave. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. 2 choices that you need to take before you give up on your job. And don't worry if you don't have a job or if you're retired from a job. These 2 critical choices also apply to any problems that you have. So think of a job problem you have or any problem that you have. God says, before you kind of give up, and after you've done everything that you know to do, here's 2 more things to do. We're going to look at that this morning. We're going to look at this in the life of a person in the Bible who had a really bad job problem. That person is David. David, throughout the Bible, had many jobs. Do you remember what his first job was? What was David's first job? He's a shepherd. And what job problems did he face there? Yeah, wild animals. Killed some of them with his bare hands. But today we're looking at his second job. His second job that he had, do you remember what that was? Playing the harp. It was a part-time job, playing the harp. for King Saul. If you remember, King Saul had rejected God's ways for him, and so God said, I'm removing my spirit from you, and you're no longer going to be king. I'm appointing somebody else. And instead of him being the king and all the glory he should have had, God removed his Holy Spirit from him and let him have a spirit of evil, a demonic spirit come upon Saul, where he ranted and raved. It was full of fear and full of anxiety and depression. It was really dark. And his servants suggested that there is this skilled harp player named David that we know, and he could come in and play for you and help you when you have these rages. And that's exactly what happened. Saul heard that, and he agreed, and he called David to play. Now, do you think that was just a coincidence? Do you think that suggestion from that servant to have David come into the court was a coincidence? Absolutely not. It was not a coincidence. Think about this. Imagine you have to take a young man, and he is a shepherd, used to being out in the fields, watching a bunch of sheep, and you need to train him to become the king of the country with all the leadership skills and all the management skills and all the international skills. How do you take that young, uneducated, really low level of society to the highest level of society? How are you going to take him from here to there? Where would you start? God had a perfect plan all set up in order to get David there. And it included, as the first step, is to get David's foot in the door of the courts of the king. And that was get him in there as the player of the harp for the king. It was not a coincidence that David was chosen, thought of and chosen to get in there. And by the way, it wasn't a coincidence for David, and it's not a coincidence for you either. Whatever job you have right now, do you think you're there by coincidence? No. God has arranged your life and the steps of your life. And unless you're just absolutely rejecting God and running 100 miles away from him like Jonah, God has you at your place on purpose, doing what you're there to do on purpose. And just like David was having this all in order to become something better, God has you there. One of the reasons is for you to be trained into becoming something better. It wasn't a coincidence. All right, let's look at David's new part-time job. It says in 1 Samuel 16, so Saul sent messengers to Jesse, his father, and said, send me your son David, who is with the flock. And then David came to Saul and attended him, and Saul loved him greatly. And he became his armor bearer. Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David now stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. Yeah, so David shows up to play in the king's court, and you can imagine how intimidating that was. Here he is, just a shepherd boy from nowhere, and he takes his harp and he pushes open the court doors and he walks into the courtroom of the king. It would have been really intimidating, but man, no problems here. The king immediately loved him. He played for him and soothed him, and he loved him so much he said, I'm going to make you my armor bearer. That is, you're going to carry my armor into battle. Here he is one day, shepherd. Next day, he's totally favored and lifted up on high in order to come into the courts of the king. Imagine that happening to you. So you show up the first day on your new job and you're, a little anxious and wondering how this is going to go. And immediately the owner of the company takes notice of you out of all the other employees, and his heart just bonds to you, and he immediately gives you a promotion to a higher responsibility. That's what was going on in David's life. And it had to have answered a lot of David's questions. Here he is, a shepherd boy, watching flocks in the field. The prophet comes up to him and says, you're going to be king one day. He's got to wonder, wait, first of all, me? I'm really low in society. And how? How am I going to become king? And suddenly the king calls him and says, I want you to play. And he goes, uh-oh, maybe this is the beginning of the whole process. The next thing you know, he's favored. And the next thing you know, the king's armor bearer is going to march onto the battlefield with him. And you can see David's mind going, okay, this must be how it's supposed to work. I'm going to just eventually be in here. I'm favored. I've been given a promotion. I guess eventually he's just going to turn over the kingdom to me. And that might have been God's original plan. Except Saul was totally derailed himself from God's plan, totally rejected God. And so God had to work another plan, and it turned out to be One of the worst job problems in human history to happen for poor David. In the very next chapter, David steps out onto a battlefield and faces Goliath the giant and defeats him. And instantly he's raised up to national status. So he'd been in the courts of the king in kind of a low servant realm. He defeats David, and now everybody knows about him. Everybody is singing about him. It says all Israel loved him. He immediately got an invitation from the king to live in the king's palace, not just visit there when he needed to play the harp, to live in the king's palace, eat at the king's table, marry the king's daughter. I mean, this is the express route to being into kingly, courtly realms. I mean, it's just happening to David. He's given a high command in the army because of this one incident, and now marches out onto the battlefield with the king as his armor bearer, and much more than his armor bearer, as a leader of thousands. And all of Israel singing about him. Remember what they were singing? Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his 10,000s. Whoops. That didn't go over well. Saul's saying, wait, what? This guy I just promoted, yes, he killed Goliath, but he hasn't killed as many as I have. They're saying he's a greater warrior than I am. And suddenly, the king is envious and fearful, it says, and paranoid, and he seeks to kill David. Look at 1 Samuel 18. It says, now it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual. And the spear was in Saul's hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. And David escaped from his presence twice. Okay, imagine you're working for your new employer, and he pulls a gun on you and shoots at you, and he misses. And you take off. Would you return? David returned. And he did it again. And after the second time, David returned again. Would you do that? How many times would that have to happen with you or your employer takes a shot at you? It seems that after the third time, that was enough for David. In chapter 19, it says, now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul, and he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand. And Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence so that he stuck the spear into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. After 3 times, that was it. David didn't go back. So Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and kill him when he went back to his house. And so David slipped out of the city and fled into the desert to live in caves. So you think you have a job problem? This is a bad one. Imagine you're doing your work on the job as best you can, and suddenly your employer just turns against you, envies you, is paranoid of you, hates you, and tries to kill you. So you quit your job and you move out of the country, or rather out of the state. So you move to another state to avoid him and put this all behind you, but he follows you. And he's not just a normal employer. He's the President of the United States, with all the military of the United States to be able to hunt you down and kill you. That was David's job problem. How did he handle it? David handled it so well. I encourage you to read through these chapters, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Read through that this week. It is amazing how David handled it. I mean, I was so impressed. And yet, all the things he tried to fix it, every single one failed. I mean, it didn't work. It didn't resolve Saul to stop hunting him to try and kill him. Temporarily, but not permanently. And so when we come to Psalm 142 in front of us, that's the whole backstory of Psalm 142. 142, David is sitting alone in a cave in the desert. And he sits and writes this psalm. And reading it shows us two crucial choices David makes when having job problems. I mean, he'd done everything he knew how to do to fix it, and it wasn't working, and yet he took two more steps, two more crucial choices he made for his job problems. They're what we should make in all of our job problems and any problem we have, taking these two steps. You've heard these before, but we can tend to forget them when we have problems. So David lived in the king's palace, ate at the king's table, commanded the king's soldiers, and was loved by everyone in Israel. And suddenly, everything changes. He's sitting alone, no one around him, in a cave in the desert with thousands of people trying to kill him. What about God's plan to make him king? I'm sure he thought, it's got to be over. I'm about to die. What options are left for me to do? David took two options. Let's read this whole psalm. Psalm 142. I cry aloud with my voice to the Lord. I make supplication with my voice to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I declare my trouble before him. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, you knew my path. In the way where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look to the right and see, for there is no one who regards me. There is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring my soul out of prison, so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. All right. What would most people be doing hiding in this cave from the thousands of people that were hunting for him in the desert? I think most people would be terrified, trembling, afraid, depressed, maybe considering suicide. So it's really, really dark. And the first thing we find David doing is just intense prayer. That's what this psalm is, intense prayer. And that's on your insert. In your insert, the first choice to make after you've done everything you know to do to solve a problem is intense prayer. Intense prayer. And of course, prayer should be the first thing and the middle thing and the last thing you do for any problem and your job problem. But what do you do when you've done everything you know how to do, as David had? You've talked to everyone in the company, you've addressed every possible thing, and you say, okay, I just got to quit. No, God says two more things to do. Number one, intense prayer. Intense prayer. Look at this and how he describes it. Verse 1, I cry aloud. Verse 2, I pour out my complaint. Verse 5, I cry out to you. Verse 6, give heed to my cry. This was no silent bowing of his head and closing his eyes. This is a loud prayer, a very loud prayer. Look at all the crying and pouring out and crying and crying. David is releasing all his emotions, all his frustrations, all his fears, everything just out to God. It's a shock that they didn't hear him in this cave, because this is loud. And it isn't the only time he does this. It says in Psalm 57, a mitkim, or a musical term there, of David, when he fled from Saul in the cave, be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me. I cry out, literally cry out to God Most High. What choice should you make when you've done everything you know how to do to fix a problem? You cry out to God to get everything he can do to fix the problem. That's what David's teaching you. When you've done everything you know to do, cry out to God to do everything he can do. That's Psalm 142. In your job problem, are you praying? I would say, knowing most of you, you are praying. Question, how are you praying? There's times, regular times of silent praying for something, but then there's also times when the appropriate thing to do is loud crying out, praying to God. Just bearing your emotions, your frustration, your anger, your worry, your fears, just letting it out to God in a place where it's safe to just be loud about it. That's what David was doing. In your job problem, does God see a person like David who's crying out for his help, desperately just losing everything and crying out for help? God may be waiting to deal with your problem until you show him you need him enough to step in. David teaches us there are times when it's not appropriate for quiet, silent prayer. And if you read the Psalms, you know these are through all the Psalms. Just this loud crying. Find some place that you can be honest and just get everything out before God. Intense praying. That's the first step that David's example shows us here. Pray intensely when you've got a job problem or any problem that you've just done everything you know to do and you're going to give up. Turn, number one, to intense prayer. And then number two, David's example shows us something else. Look again at how miserable David is in these verses. Verse 2 says, he talks about his complaint and his trouble. Verse 3, he's overwhelmed by the traps set for him. Verse 4, there's no escape. No one cares for him. Verse 6, he's very low. Verse 7, bring my soul out of prison. His soul, the innermost part of him, was in prison. So how's David feeling? He's about as low as he could go. He's absolutely miserable here in the desert. He's gripped with terrible misery. And the first thing he does is he cries out in intense prayer. But then the second thing we see him doing is he stops crying out about what's going wrong and he starts listing the things that are going right in this prayer. He starts listing the things that will go right. Read with me verse 5 again. Verse 5 says, I cried out to you, O Lord. I said, and here's what's going right. You are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Jump down to verse 7. Bring my soul out of prison so that I may give thanks to your name. And then he says, the righteous people will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. I am being hunted by people seeking to kill me, but you are my refuge out here as I'm alone in the desert. I am all alone in this cave, but righteous people will surround me one day. I am being dealt with terribly. You are going to deal with me bountifully. What is this happening? Those things aren't happening. But David is taking hold of the promises of God and says, I know what you have promised, and I'm going to cling to those promises right now. Now, based on the verses that we have here, is David feeling these words? No, David is feeling this. Utter despair. No one cares me. I'm all alone. I'm in prison. That's how David's feeling. But the words that he's saying, especially in verse 7, are saying something different. I'm going to be surrounded by righteous people, and God is going to deal bountifully. What's going on here? Is he feeling those words? I don't think so at all. I think he's feeling misery, but he is digging deep and grabbing hold of trusting God and saying this anyway because he believes and chooses to believe it's going to be true for his future. You know, we have Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in such misery, in such despair. I shouldn't say despair, in such agony that it says it almost killed him. And he's in this great agony, and yet he ends his prayer, nevertheless, thy will be done. Now, Jesus' emotions are in horrible agony, but he says to God, thy will be done. I believe Jesus was saying that through clenched teeth. Because he was almost to the point of death in his agony, but he says through clenched teeth, thy will be done. I want you to let me escape, but let thy will be done. I'm in such agony here. I believe David's prayer, especially at the end of verse 7 here, I believe that was through clenched teeth. I'm in horrible pain, agony, despair, prison. Nevertheless, you will deal bountifully with me. I will be surrounded by righteous people. Did he feel it? I don't believe he felt it. But he chose it because it was God's promise to him. He chose to cling to God's promise when he felt horrible. That is the second choice we see David making in your insert. Number 1 is intensely pray. Number 2, start listing what God promises will go right. Start listing what God promises will go right. Listen, when your feelings are really, really low, you can still make the choice to cling to God's promises. When your feelings are low, you can still have the ability to make the choice through gritted teeth, if you have to, of what you believe. It's just a matter of time before God is going to bring good. So it's just a matter of how long you have to wait. In time, God's going to bring good. The only question is, how long do you have to wait for it? But you say, but why do I have to wait at all? God has all the power to be able to stop my problems like that. Why doesn't God stop my problem today? And that's the question everyone asks. We look around the world in the shape of nations and communities and homes. Why doesn't God just fix all these problems right this second? We know he can do it. And there are many, many complex answers to those questions. But one absolutely certain answer to what God has to say of why he doesn't stop your problem today is it's very likely God's plan to train us through our problems. If you're experiencing a job problem today, you've done everything you know to do, and it's not working. Why is God allowing it? Very likely to train you through the problem. To train you through the problem. That is what was going on here in the life of David. As he's sitting there in that thing, he is promised to be the king of Israel, but he's a poor shepherd boy. And the next thing he knows, God sends him to king's school. Yeah? God sends him to king's school here in this cave. He first was placed in the palace to be able to learn about kingly ways. Next thing he knows, he's advanced, promoted to follow the king out onto the battlefield. The next thing he knows, he's placed in charge of thousands of soldiers in order to learn leadership skills. Next thing he knows, he's running into battles at the front, defeating his enemies, learning skills and wisdom and dependence upon God. Then the next thing he knows, he's totally alone in a cave running for his life. And that's training him in humility and brokenness before God and in deep dependence upon God as he's crying out to God and deepening his faith by clinging to the promises of God that he says he expects in the future. All of this to train David to move from a shepherd boy into a great king. And all the skills that are needed, all of this is training. Being there in that cave with all training on how to be a king. That was God's detailed plan for him to get him onto the throne. And of course, you know, David is not the only one being trained to be a king. Revelation 5:10, you made them a kingdom and they will rule as kings on the earth. Who's that talking about? All those who love Jesus Christ. If you love Jesus Christ today, you will one day reign as a world leader on this world with Jesus Christ, sharing his rule on this world. You say, me? How in the world? I live in central Pennsylvania. I'm no one special. How in the world am I going to do that? God says, I got a plan for you. I have a whole series of events for your life to move you from being where you are today into being worthy and ready to be in leadership of the world with me one day. And God's working that out in your life. And as you read and learn the Bible, you learn about God, you learn about his ways, you learn about his kingdom. As you learn more of the Bible, you learn about how you are supposed to think and how you're supposed to speak and how you're supposed to act and how you're supposed to plan. And then God says, I will also supply problems for your life, job problems even, so that you can learn how to apply what I've taught you and give yourself to speaking the right way, thinking the right way, acting the right way, and planning the right way. And as you exercise these things, you are taking yourself higher and higher and higher in your training as a future world leader. Just like David, you are on a path of training to be a person who reigns. That is not an easy thing to go through. Just like David didn't have an easy thing at the time of it in this cave. But it's not out of control. All the different problems of your life, you can say, okay, God is training me through this. God is training me to reign with him one day through this. Whether it's a job problem or any problem, God promises. James 1:2, Count it all joy because it's making you better. Not that that thing is joyful or even good or even approved by God, but if He's let it into your life, it's to make you better so you can rule with Him one day. You're on the same track as David was. You will reign, and he did end up reigning. Here are 3 of God's promises to start listing when you're in that dark place. And I put these in your insert as well. There are many, of course, but here are 3 that I think are helpful. Number 1, this will end in good for me. So it's dark. You don't see any way out. It's like you're in a cave. How can this possibly work for good? You claim God's promise. This will end in good for you. Because that's God's promise. He doesn't lie. Number 2, this will perfect me to be like Jesus. There's James 1, 2 through 4. This will perfect me to be like Jesus. If I respond the right way, this will perfect me to be like Jesus. And then number 3, this will end in God renewing and comforting me. How is this going to end? This will end in God renewing and comforting me. That's how this is going to end. What lies ahead for you? What lies ahead for you is it's going to end in good. You're going to be perfected, and God's also going to renew and comfort you through this. Claim that now. Look ahead and say, even if it's through gritted teeth, these 3 things will happen to me. God doesn't ask you to feel it. He asks you to choose it. In fact, I think it's more special to God when you choose it when you don't feel it. Because when you feel real wonderful about God, it's easy to claim His promises. But when you don't feel good and you claim His promises anyway, I think that's very impressive. I think that's a great act of faith. So think of a job problem or any problem that you have. Start listing these things that God says will happen to you. That's what David teaches us to do. In just a matter of time, God is going to bring good, and it's just a matter of waiting until it happens. That's the theme this morning, isn't it? Waiting. We've sung about it, and now the sermon talks about it. If you're in that spot of waiting, how long do you have to wait? Well, how long did David have to wait? How long was he out in the desert running from the king? 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years David was out there. Running from cave to cave, town to town, dodging multiple ambushes and hunts as the king was seeking him. I encourage you to read those. And yet, God didn't take King Saul's life. Could have taken King Saul's life and ended everything easily. Didn't do it for 8 long years. Until one day God says, enough. It's my plan for Saul to die on a hillside in a battle. And he did. And David's waiting was over. And so your waiting will be over too one day. When God will bring you to stand alongside him and rule the world as a world leader. One day that waiting will end, as it ended for David. One word. As an employee, of course, you have the opportunity to just at any moment quit your job and go find another one. But I urge you to be careful about that. Always consider whether Jesus is wanting you to work through the problem instead of escaping the problem. I think we can run away from a job problem or any problem to get relief when God's perfect plan would have been, no, I really wanted you to hang in there and tough it out for a while. Maybe not permanently, but for longer than you're doing it. How do you know when it's time to leave or not, when it's time to quit or not? I think you can easily just ask God to close all doors to other job opportunities. So if you got this really miserable job and you start looking for new jobs, just say, God, close the doors if you don't want me to stay in my or you want me staying where I am. Close the doors for where I'm looking. And if you want me to move, open the doors and I'll go. Just ask God what to do. Ask him how long to stay. Don't just knee-jerk and say, I'm out of here, I quit. God says that you've done everything that you know to do 2 things based on what David did. What were they? Number 1, pray intensely. Don't give up before you pray intensely. Get along with God, crying out to God. God may be waiting to see how much you care about him and seeking him, and then he'll move in. So cry out intensely to God. In your problem today, job problem, whatever problem, intensely cry out to God like David did. And number two, start listing all the things that God promises will go right. So you don't see that when you're in the midst of the darkness, but start listing all the things that God says will go right. It's going to end in good. It's going to perfect me. And it's going to end in God comforting me and renewing me through this. Claim those things, even if it's through clenched teeth. Claim those things this morning. Is God asking you to change anything today? If you sense Him asking you to change anything, say yes to Him. And then make that change. God has you on a track of dealing with your problems His way so that you are trained to be able to one day reign with Him in this new world. What a wonderful day that's going to be. Look forward to that.